Emily Carter's hands trembled as she clutched the stack of documents that had just destroyed her career. The boardroom fell silent, 20 pairs of eyes staring at her like she'd committed corporate treason. Ryan Mitchell stood at the head of the mahogany table, his blue eyes cold as winter steel, pointing an accusatory finger in her direction. "These are confidential merger documents that were supposed to be secured in my private office. Can you explain why they were found on your desk, Miss Carter?" The words hit her like a physical blow. Emily had been at Mitchell Industries for exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes. She'd spent the morning organizing files that the previous assistant had left in complete chaos, trying to make sense of a system that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. When she'd found the manila envelope wedged behind a filing cabinet, she'd simply moved it to her desk to determine where it belonged. "Mr. Mitchell, I was organizing the files left by your previous assistant. I found these documents behind the cabinet and was trying to figure out where they should be filed. I haven't read them or shared them with anyone." Ryan's jaw tightened. The Hartwell acquisition has been in development for 6 months. These documents contain sensitive financial projections and strategic plans. Do you understand the implications if this information were to leak? Heat flooded Emily's cheeks. Around the table, board members whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads disapprovingly. She recognized the setup immediately. Someone had planted those documents, and she was the perfect scapegoat. The new girl. The outsider. The one nobody would believe. "I understand perfectly," Emily said, her voice gaining strength despite the humiliation burning through her chest. "What I don't understand is how you can accuse someone of corporate espionage without a shred of evidence beyond circumstantial placement of documents." The room erupted in murmurs. Ryan's eyebrows shot up, clearly not expecting pushback from someone who'd been employed for less than 5 hours. "Circumstantial evidence has been enough to ruin careers, Miss Carter. In my experience, when sensitive documents end up in the wrong hands, it's rarely an accident." Emily stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the boardroom like a gunshot. She'd walked away from her life in Denver for this opportunity. She'd spent her last $300 on a security deposit for a studio apartment she couldn't afford. She believed Mitchell Industries would be different from the toxic corporate environments she'd escaped. She'd been wrong. "Your experience must be quite limited then," Emily said, meeting Ryan's glare with one of her own. "Because in my experience, successful leaders investigate before they accuse. They gather facts before they destroy reputations. They show basic human decency before they humiliate employees in front of an entire board." The silence that followed was deafening. Board members exchanged shocked glances. Ryan's face had gone pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Emily reached into her purse and pulled out her employee badge, setting it on the table with deliberate precision. "Consider this my resignation, effective immediately. I'd rather be unemployed than work for someone who values paranoia over professionalism." She turned on her heel and walked toward the boardroom doors, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, she heard chairs scraping and urgent whispers, but she didn't look back. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead of her, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps. The elevator seemed miles away. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, her legs heavy with the weight of another failed fresh start. She'd burned through her savings to get here. Her car payment was due next week. Her student loans never took a break. The familiar panic of financial uncertainty crept up her throat like bile. She jabbed the elevator call button repeatedly, willing the doors to open faster. Behind her, she heard the boardroom doors burst open and footsteps echoing down the hallway. Heavy footsteps. Male footsteps. Getting closer. "Miss Carter." She didn't turn around. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open with agonizing slowness. "Miss Carter, wait." Emily stepped into the elevator and turned around, finger hovering over the close button. Ryan Mitchell was striding toward her, his expensive suit slightly wrinkled, his perfect hair mussed like he'd run his hands through it. He looked younger somehow, less intimidating outside the boardroom's formal atmosphere. "I said wait. I heard you the first time." Emily pressed the button for the ground floor. "I also heard you loud and clear in that boardroom. There's nothing left to discuss." Ryan reached the elevator just as the doors began to close. He slammed his hand against the sensor, forcing them to reopen, and stepped inside. The space immediately felt smaller, charged with tension and something else Emily couldn't identify. You can't just walk away. Watch me. Emily pressed the close button again, but Ryan's hand shot out to block it. I'm offering you a different position. Emily laughed, the sound sharp and bitter in the confined space. Are you serious right now? You just accused me of corporate espionage in front of your entire board, and now you want to offer me a job? Personal assistant. Direct report to me. Triple the salary you were quoted for the executive assistant position. The elevator lurched into motion, carrying them down toward the lobby. Emily stared at Ryan's reflection in the polished metal doors, trying to process what he'd just said. Triple the salary would solve her immediate financial problems. It would give her breathing room to figure out her next move. But working directly for the man who'd just humiliated her seemed like professional suicide. Why? Ryan was quiet for a long moment, studying her profile as the floor numbers counted down. Because in 20 minutes, you're the first person who's ever stood up to me in that boardroom. Because you were right about investigating before accusing. And because I think I may have made a mistake. The elevator dinged softly as they reached the ground floor. The doors slid open to reveal the bustling lobby of Mitchell Industries. People in expensive suits hurrying past with phones pressed to their ears and tablets clutched in their hands. Emily's old life waited just beyond those revolving doors. Unemployment. Uncertainty. Another failed attempt at stability. She looked at Ryan Mitchell, really looked at him for the first time since the boardroom disaster. His blue eyes held something she hadn't expected to see, genuine regret. Not the calculated remorse of a man trying to avoid a lawsuit, but the real discomfort of someone who'd realized they'd acted poorly. Triple the salary, she said finally. Full benefits. And I want a written contract stating that my employment cannot be terminated without cause and proper documentation. Ryan nodded slowly. Agreed. Emily stepped out of the elevator, then turned back to face him. One more thing, Mr. Mitchell. If you ever humiliate me like that again, I won't just quit. I'll make sure everyone in Boston knows exactly what kind of leader you really are. She walked away without waiting for his response, her heels clicking against the marble floor of the lobby. Behind her, she heard the elevator doors close with a soft whisper, carrying Ryan Mitchell back up to his empire of glass and steel. Emily had no idea she'd just agreed to work for a man whose life was about to explode in ways that would drag them both into a web of secrets, lies, and a love neither of them saw coming. Emily arrived at Mitchell Industries at 7:30 the next morning, 2 hours before the official start time Ryan had specified. She'd spent the previous evening drafting a list of non-negotiable conditions for their working relationship, and she planned to establish boundaries before he had a chance to assume otherwise. The executive floor was eerily quiet, with only the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of Boston traffic filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Emily made her way to the assistant's desk outside Ryan's corner office, noting the organized chaos her predecessor had left behind. File folders were stacked haphazardly. The phone had 17 unheard voicemails, and the calendar system looked like it hadn't been updated in weeks. She was halfway through sorting the mess when Ryan's voice cut through the silence. You're early. Emily didn't look up from the stack of contracts she was organizing. I'm thorough. There's a difference. Ryan emerged from his office carrying a steaming cup of coffee, his suit already immaculate despite the early hour. He studied her for a moment, taking in her crisp white blouse and black pencil skirt, her hair pulled back in a professional bun. We need to discuss expectations, Emily said, pulling a typed document from her purse. I've prepared a list of professional boundaries that need to be established before we proceed. Ryan raised an eyebrow but accepted the paper. As he read, Emily watched his expression shift from amusement to surprise to something approaching respect. No personal errands outside of business hours, he read aloud. No commentary on my personal life or appearance. All instructions must be given with reasonable notice except in genuine emergencies. Professional communication at all times. He looked up at her. This reads like a legal contract. Because it essentially is one. I'm not your personal assistant in the traditional sense, Mr. Mitchell. I'm a professional who happens to assist you with professional matters. The distinction is important. Ryan folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Agreed. But I have conditions of my own. Emily finally looked up from the files, meeting his gaze directly. Such as, Complete discretion about everything you see and hear in this office. No questions about phone calls, meetings, or visitors unless I specifically ask for your input. And absolutely no discussion of company business with anyone outside this building. The intensity in his voice caught Emily's attention. These weren't the usual confidentiality requirements of executive assistants. There was an edge of desperation underneath his controlled exterior, a hint that something much larger was at stake. That goes without saying, Emily replied. Though I should point out that confidentiality works both ways. If you want my discretion, you need to provide me with enough information to do my job effectively. Ryan's phone buzzed on his desk. The sound seemed to jolt him, and Emily noticed the way his shoulders tensed, the quick flash of something that looked like fear across his features before he composed himself. We'll start with reviewing the Hartwell acquisition timeline, he said, but his attention was clearly divided. I need a comprehensive analysis of all communications from the past 6 months, organized by priority level and urgency. Over the following days, Emily began to notice patterns in Ryan's behavior that didn't align with typical executive stress. Phone calls that made him leave the office entirely. Meetings that were scheduled and canceled at the last minute. Legal documents that appeared on his desk overnight and disappeared before Emily arrived each morning. On Thursday, she watched through the glass walls of his office as a man in an expensive charcoal suit visited Ryan for the 3rd time that week. The stranger's body language was aggressive, leaning forward across Ryan's desk while gesturing emphatically. Ryan sat rigid in his chair, his face a mask of controlled anger. When the meeting ended, Ryan emerged looking like he'd aged 10 years in 30 minutes. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there was a thin line of perspiration along his collar despite the office's aggressive air conditioning. Cancel my 2 o'clock with the Henderson Group, he said without making eye contact. Reschedule for next week. That's the 3rd Henderson meeting you've canceled this month, Emily observed carefully. Should I provide them with an explanation? Ryan's jaw tightened. Tell them I'm dealing with family matters. The lie was obvious, but Emily didn't push. Instead, she made a note to research the Henderson Group and their connection to Mitchell Industries. If she was going to maintain Ryan's schedule effectively, she needed to understand what was driving these constant disruptions. Friday brought another strange visitor, this time a woman with silver hair and an Hermes briefcase who spent 2 hours behind closed doors with Ryan. Emily could hear raised voices through the supposedly soundproof glass, though she couldn't make out specific words. When the woman finally left, Ryan called Emily into his office. He was standing at the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the Boston skyline like it held answers to questions he couldn't voice. I need you to clear my calendar for Monday morning, he said without turning around, and arrange for a secure conference room on the 20th floor. No windows, no recording equipment. Emily made the notes, but found herself studying Ryan's reflection in the window. The confident CEO who dominated that boardroom a week ago seemed to be fracturing around the edges, replaced by someone carrying a weight that was slowly crushing him. Will there be anything else? She asked. Ryan turned to face her, and for a moment, Emily saw past the professional facade to something raw and vulnerable underneath. The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with an awareness that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the way his eyes lingered on her face. Emily, he said, and her name sounded different in his voice. Softer, more personal. She took an involuntary step backward, bumping into the chair behind her. The spell broke instantly, professionalism slamming back into place like a protective wall. Miss Carter, Ryan corrected himself, the formal distance returning to his tone. That will be all for today. Emily nodded and headed toward the door, but she could feel his eyes following her movement. In the hallway, she pressed her back against the wall and took a steadying breath. Working for Ryan Mitchell was proving more complicated than she'd anticipated, and not just because of the mysterious meetings and canceled appointments. There was something building between them, an electric tension that crackled every time they shared the same space. Emily had felt it in the elevator that first day, dismissed it as adrenaline from their confrontation. But it was growing stronger, more difficult to ignore. She thought about the way Ryan's voice had softened when he'd said her name, the way his gaze had lingered a fraction too long on her lips when she'd spoken, the way her pulse had quickened when he'd stepped closer. Emily Carter had built her career on maintaining professional boundaries, on never letting personal feelings complicate business relationships. But as she walked back to her desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan Mitchell was going to test every defense she'd ever constructed. Behind his office door, she could hear Ryan's voice again, low and urgent, speaking to someone on the phone. Whatever secrets he was carrying, whatever was driving the fear she glimpsed in unguarded moments, Emily was becoming more involved by the day. She just didn't realize yet how deep those secrets ran, or how they would ultimately destroy everything she thought she knew about the man she was slowly, dangerously, beginning to care about. Emily was reviewing vendor contracts when the call came through on Tuesday morning. The number wasn't in the system, and Ryan was in back-to-back meetings until 3, so she almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her pick up on the fourth ring. Mitchell Industries, Ryan Mitchell's office. "I'm looking for Emily Carter." The voice was gravelly, weathered by decades of cigarettes and late nights. Emily's grip tightened on the phone. Very few people knew she worked here, and none of them would call the main corporate line. "This is Emily. Who's calling?" "James Parker. I'm a retired detective with Boston PD. I have some information about your mother that I think you need to hear." Emily's blood turned to ice water. She'd spent 24 years believing her mother Sarah had died in a random car accident when Emily was 4. The case had been closed decades ago, filed away with thousands of other traffic fatalities that plagued major cities every year. "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong person. My mother's case was resolved a long time ago." Sarah Carter, age 28, died on Route 93 southbound on March 15, 24 years ago. Vehicle went off the road during a rainstorm, hit a concrete barrier. No witnesses. Case closed within 48 hours. Parker's voice was matter-of-fact, reciting details like he was reading from a file. Except it shouldn't have been closed. Emily looked around the bustling office, suddenly feeling exposed. Through Ryan's glass walls, she could see him gesturing emphatically during his conference call, completely absorbed in whatever crisis demanded his attention this week. "I can't discuss this here," Emily said quietly. "Can we meet somewhere? Corner of Newberry and Berkeley, there's a coffee shop called Grind. 1 hour." The line went dead. Emily stared at the phone for a full minute before setting it back in the cradle. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she clasped them together to stop the tremor. Every instinct told her to ignore the call, to let sleeping ghosts stay buried. But something else, some deeper need for truth, made her grab her coat. She left a note for Ryan about a family emergency and took the elevator down to street level. Boston's afternoon traffic was already building, horns blaring as delivery trucks blocked intersections and pedestrians darted between idling cars. The coffee shop was a 15-minute walk, giving Emily time to construct a mental fortress against whatever James Parker was about to tell her. She spotted him immediately when she walked in. Mid-60s, gray hair cropped military short, wearing a worn leather jacket that had seen better decades. He was sitting in a corner booth, nursing black coffee and studying everyone who entered like he was still working active cases. "Emily Carter," he said as she approached. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Parker." Emily slid into the booth across from him, noting the manila folder lying closed beside his coffee cup. "You said you had information about my mother." Parker opened the folder without preamble, revealing police reports, photographs, and newspaper clippings yellowed with age. Emily's breath caught when she saw her mother's driver's license photo paper-clipped to the top page. Sarah had Emily's eyes, the same determined set to her jaw. "Your mother was a forensic accountant," Parker began. "Worked for several high-profile firms in Boston, including Mitchell Industries. She was investigating discrepancies in their charitable foundation accounts when she died." Emily's stomach dropped. "Mitchell Industries? Are you sure?" "Positive." Sarah Carter had been working there for 6 months, brought in to audit their books after some irregularities surfaced during a routine SEC review. She discovered a complex money laundering operation running through fake charities and shell companies. Millions of dollars being funneled through the system. Parker pulled out a photocopy of a handwritten note. Emily recognized her mother's careful script immediately, the way she dotted her I's with small circles instead of points. She was documenting everything. Names, dates, bank account numbers. This note was found in her apartment after the accident, hidden in a cookbook. Parker pointed to a line near the bottom of the page. "See this? Robert Mitchell knows. Meeting tomorrow to discuss next steps." Emily's hands were trembling now. Robert Mitchell, Ryan's father, the founder of the company where she now worked, sitting 30 floors above them in his glass tower built on blood money. The meeting never happened, Parker continued. Sarah died that night on her way home from the office. Rainstorm came out of nowhere. Visibility dropped to nothing. Her car went off the road at 70 miles per hour. Accidents happen, Emily said weakly, but even as she spoke the words, she didn't believe them. Parker pulled out crime scene photos that made Emily's stomach lurch. The twisted metal that had once been her mother's Honda Civic was barely recognizable. But Parker wasn't showing her the wreckage. He was pointing to the guardrail. See these impact marks? Your mother's car hit the barrier 3 times before going over. That doesn't happen in a weather-related accident. Someone forced her off the road. Emily pushed the photos away, unable to look anymore. Why are you telling me this now? Why not 24 years ago? Because 24 years ago, I was a junior detective with a mortgage and 2 kids to feed. When my captain told me to close the case, I closed it. But I kept copies of everything. Parker's voice was heavy with regret. I've been carrying this guilt ever since. When I heard you were working at Mitchell Industries, I knew I had to speak up. How did you know where I worked? Word gets around in law enforcement circles, especially when someone with your last name starts working for the same family that may have killed your mother. Emily felt sick. The coffee shop's warmth was suddenly stifling, the chatter of other customers a meaningless buzz in her ears. She thought about Ryan, about the way he'd looked at her yesterday when he'd said her name, about the mysterious meetings and phone calls that made him look like a hunted man. Does Ryan know? She asked. About your mother's investigation? Unknown. About your identity? I doubt it, or you wouldn't still be employed there. Parker gathered the photos back into his folder. But Robert Mitchell knew exactly who your mother was and what she'd discovered. And 3 days later, she was dead. Emily stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need to go. Emily, wait. Parker reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. If you want to know the truth about what happened to your mother, call me. But be careful. If I'm right about this, you're working for the family that destroyed yours. Emily took the card with numb fingers and walked out of the coffee shop into the cold Boston afternoon. The city looked different now, more dangerous, full of shadows that hadn't existed an hour ago. She thought about her mother, brilliant and determined, fighting for justice right up until someone decided she was too much of a threat to live. By the time Emily made it back to Mitchell Industries, Ryan's meetings had ended. She could see him through his office walls, standing at his desk with his phone pressed to his ear. His face was pale, his free hand gripping the edge of his desk so hard his knuckles had gone white. Emily sat down at her desk and tried to focus on the purchase orders that needed approval, but her mind kept returning to the photographs in James Parker's folder. Her mother's handwriting. The twisted metal of a car that had been forced off the road by someone who wanted to keep their secrets buried. When Ryan finally emerged from his office 20 minutes later, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there was a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the office's efficient climate control. Everything all right? Emily asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Ryan stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his blue eyes. Family matters, he said finally, but the words sounded hollow. Always family matters. He walked away without another word, leaving Emily alone with the growing certainty that James Parker was right. She was working for the enemy, falling for a man whose family had destroyed everything she'd ever loved. And the worst part was, she was starting to suspect that Ryan might be in just as much danger as she was. Emily spent 3 sleepless nights staring at James Parker's business card before deciding to confront Ryan directly. She couldn't keep working beside him, feeling the magnetic pull that drew her closer every day, while harboring the suspicion that his family had murdered her mother. The uncertainty was eating her alive. Thursday evening found most of the office empty, the cleaning crews making their rounds while a skeleton staff finished urgent projects. Emily had stayed late deliberately, knowing Ryan rarely left before 8. When she finally gathered the courage to knock on his office door, he looked up from a stack of legal documents with exhausted eyes. Come in, he said, loosening his tie. I was wondering when you'd stop avoiding me. Emily stepped inside, closing the door behind her. We need to talk. Ryan gestured to the chair across from his desk, but Emily remained standing. The distance felt necessary, a buffer against the way her pulse quickened whenever they were alone together. "Someone contacted me this week," she began. "A retired detective named James Parker. He told me some interesting things about my mother's death." Ryan went very still. The papers in his hands seemed forgotten as he studied Emily's face with an intensity that made her skin burn. "What kind of things?" "That she didn't die in an accident. That she was investigating money laundering at Mitchell Industries when someone forced her car off the road." Emily's voice remained steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He said she was meeting with your father the day she died." Ryan closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair like he'd been expecting this conversation for years. When he opened them again, the careful professional mask he always wore had slipped, revealing something raw and painful underneath. "Sit down, Emily, please." This time she took the chair, though every muscle in her body remained coiled for flight. Ryan stood and walked to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the darkened glass. "My father built this company on legitimate business for the first 15 years, he said quietly. "Construction contracts, real estate development, nothing glamorous but profitable. Then he got involved with some investors who weren't particular about where their money came from." Emily watched the tension in Ryan's shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. It started small. Cash transactions that didn't get reported properly. Invoices for services that were never performed. By the time I graduated college and joined the company, the legitimate business was just a front for washing dirty money through a network of fake charities and shell corporations. "And you knew about this?" Ryan turned to face her, and Emily saw the anguish he'd been hiding behind polished professionalism for months. "I suspected. There were too many discrepancies, too many meetings my father wouldn't let me attend. But I was 25 and naive enough to believe he'd never involve me in anything illegal." "When did you find out for sure?" "When your mother died." Ryan's voice cracked slightly on the words. The timing was too convenient. Sarah Carter discovers a massive money laundering operation, and 3 days later, she's dead in a car accident? I confronted my father, demanded answers. Emily's heart was hammering so hard, she was sure Ryan could hear it across the room. "What did he tell you?" "That accidents happen to people who dig too deep into other people's business. That Sarah Carter had made some dangerous accusations that could have destroyed innocent lives." Ryan's laugh was bitter. He never admitted to having her killed, but he didn't deny it either. The office felt too small suddenly, the air too thin. Emily gripped the arms of her chair, trying to process what Ryan was telling her. Her mother had been murdered to protect the Mitchell family fortune. The man standing across from her had suspected the truth for years, but done nothing about it. "Why didn't you go to the police?" "With what evidence?" "My father was careful, paranoid about leaving trails. And by then he was dying anyway. Pancreatic cancer. He had 6 months left when I finally pieced everything together." Ryan moved closer, close enough that Emily could see the pain etched in the lines around his eyes. "I've spent the last 5 years trying to clean up the mess he left behind. Shutting down the illegal operations, returning money to legitimate charities, cooperating with federal investigators." "Is that why you're being blackmailed?" Ryan's composure cracked completely. "How do you know about that?" "I'm not blind, Ryan. The mysterious phone calls, the canceled meetings, the way you look like you're waiting for a sword to fall. Someone's threatening you." Ryan sank into the chair beside hers, suddenly looking older than his 32 years. "My half-brother Derek. Apparently my father had an affair years ago that produced another son. Derek showed up 6 months ago with documents proving his paternity and demanding his share of the inheritance." "That doesn't sound like blackmail." "It is when he threatens to expose everything my father did if I don't give him 50% of the company. All the evidence I've been trying to bury, all the families who would be destroyed if this became public." Ryan ran his hands through his hair. "Derek doesn't want justice. He wants revenge." Emily studied his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his breath came slightly too fast. Revenge for what? For being ignored his entire life. For watching his mother struggle while we lived in mansions. For being the dirty secret nobody acknowledged. Ryan turned to meet her gaze. "I can't blame him for hating us, but I won't let him destroy innocent people to get his revenge." The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with emotions too complex to name. Emily found herself leaning forward, drawn by the vulnerability in Ryan's voice, the way he'd trusted her with secrets that could destroy him. "Emily," he said softly, and her name sounded like a prayer in his mouth. She should have pulled away when he reached for her. Should have remembered that this man's family had taken everything from her. Instead, she let him cup her face in his hands, let him close the distance between them until his lips were barely an inch from hers. "I know you have every reason to hate me," he whispered, "but I need you to know that I never meant for you to get caught up in this. If I could change what my father did, if I could bring your mother back, I would trade everything I have." Emily's resolve crumbled. She closed the final gap between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that tasted like desperation and forgiveness, and something that felt dangerously close to love. For a moment, nothing existed except the warmth of Ryan's mouth on hers, the way his hands trembled as they framed her face. Then reality crashed back in, bringing with it the weight of everything she'd learned. Emily pulled away abruptly, her heart breaking at the confusion in Ryan's eyes. "I can't do this," she whispered, standing on unsteady legs. "Not when everything between us is built on lies and death and blood money. Emily, please." But she was already walking toward the door, afraid that if she stayed another moment, she'd fall so completely that she'd never find her way back to the truth. Behind her, Ryan's phone buzzed on his desk. As Emily reached for the door handle, she heard him answer with a voice full of defeat. "What do you want, Derek?" Emily paused, her hand frozen on the door handle, as Derek Mitchell's voice carried clearly through the phone's speaker. "Time's up, brother. 50% of the company, or I go public with everything. You have 48 hours to decide." The line went dead, leaving Emily and Ryan alone with the weight of an ultimatum that would change everything. Derek Mitchell walked into Ryan's office without knocking 43 hours later, his expensive shoes silent on the plush carpet. Emily looked up from her desk to see a man who shared Ryan's height and build, but none of his warmth. Where Ryan's eyes held depth and complexity, Derek's were flat and calculating, like a predator sizing up prey. "Time to discuss terms," Derek announced, settling into one of Ryan's guest chairs like he owned the place. Ryan emerged from his inner office, his face carefully neutral despite the tension radiating from his shoulders. "Derek, I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow. I'm an early bird. Always have been." Derek's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Miss Carter, isn't it? I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Emily felt ice crystallize in her veins. There was something in Derek's tone, a casual familiarity that suggested he knew far more about her than a stranger should. "Emily Carter," she said carefully, not extending her hand. "Carter," Derek repeated, rolling the name around his mouth like he was tasting wine. Such an interesting coincidence, finding someone with that particular surname working so closely with my dear brother. Ryan moved closer to Emily's desk, positioning himself between her and Derek. "Leave her out of this." "Oh, but she's already in it, isn't she?" "Has been since the day she walked through those doors." Derek pulled a tablet from his briefcase and set it on Emily's desk. "Tell me, Miss Carter, what do you know about your mother's final weeks at Mitchell Industries?" Emily's throat constricted. "What are you talking about?" Derek swiped across the tablet screen, revealing a series of financial documents marked with dates from 24 years ago. Sarah Carter was a very thorough investigator. She documented everything she found, including her growing suspicions about who was ordering the cover-up. "That's enough," Ryan said sharply, but Derek ignored him completely. She knew someone in the Mitchell family was orchestrating the money laundering operation, but what she didn't realize was how far they'd go to protect their secrets. Derek swiped to another screen, this one showing what appeared to be a typed memo on Mitchell Industries' letterhead. Emily leaned forward despite herself, her eyes scanning the document. The memo was addressed to someone called Marcus Webb, dated 3 days before her mother's death. The content made her blood turn to ice water. "Sarah Carter has become a significant liability. Her investigation threatens not only our financial interests but the stability of the entire organization. Recommend immediate action to neutralize the threat before she can present findings to federal authorities." The memo was signed with Robert Mitchell's distinctive scrawl. "This is a fake," Ryan said immediately, but his voice lacked conviction. "DNA evidence says otherwise." Derek produced a clear plastic bag containing what looked like a hair follicle. "Found this attached to the original document in my father's private safe. Forensic analysis confirms it belongs to Sarah Carter. She handled this memo, probably confronted him with it before she died." Emily's legs gave out. and she collapsed into her chair. The room seemed to tilt sideways as the implications crashed over her. Her mother hadn't just discovered financial crimes. She'd been systematically hunted down and murdered by direct order of Robert Mitchell. "Emily," Ryan reached for her, but she flinched away from his touch. "Your father ordered my mother's execution," she whispered, staring at the memo like it might spontaneously combust. "This isn't about money laundering or corporate fraud. This is about premeditated murder." Derek leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the devastation spreading across Emily's features. Robert Mitchell was a very practical man. When Sarah threatened to expose his operation, he did what any rational businessman would do. He eliminated the problem. Ryan's face had gone ashen. "You can't prove he acted on this memo. It could have been a draft, a hypothetical discussion." "Except for the witness," Derek said casually, swiping to another screen on his tablet. This one showed a bank transfer record, moving $50,000 from a Mitchell Industries account to someone named Marcus Webb on the same day Sarah Carter died. Marcus Webb was a freelance contractor who specialized in making problems disappear. Car accidents were his specialty. Very hard to prove, very effective. Derek's smile widened. He's in federal prison now for an unrelated murder, but he's very interested in making a deal with prosecutors, especially when that deal involves testifying about past clients. Emily stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward into the wall. She felt like she was drowning, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Her mother had died because she'd been brave enough to fight corruption, and now Emily was working for the family that had destroyed her. "What do you want?" Ryan asked, his voice hollow. 50% of Mitchell Industries, transferred to my name by close of business tomorrow. All voting rights, all board privileges, all access to financial records. Derek closed the tablet with deliberate precision. In exchange, these documents stay buried and Marcus Webb keeps his mouth shut. "And if I refuse?" Derek stood, straightening his expensive tie. "Then by Monday morning, every major news outlet in the country will have copies of these documents. The FBI will reopen the Sarah Carter murder investigation. And Miss Carter here will learn exactly how deep her family's connection to the Mitchells really goes." Emily's head snapped up. "What does that mean?" Derek's smile turned predatory. "Tell her, Ryan. Tell her about the trust fund Robert set up in Sarah Carter's name. The one that's been collecting interest for 24 years, waiting for her daughter to claim it." Ryan's silence spoke volumes. Emily felt like the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. "What trust fund?" $5 million. Derek continued when Ryan remained mute. "Blood money, if you will. Robert's way of assuaging his guilt after having your mother killed. He couldn't bring her back, but he could ensure her daughter never wanted for anything." Emily's vision blurred at the edges. Everything she'd believed about her life, her struggles, her independence, was a lie. Her college education, funded by financial aid she'd thought she'd earned through merit. Her mother's life insurance policy that had seemed miraculously adequate despite Sarah's modest salary. All of it tainted by blood money from the man who'd ordered her mother's death. "I never touched that money," Ryan said desperately. "I didn't even know about it until after my father died. He left instructions that it should never be touched unless you specifically claimed it." "How thoughtful," Emily said, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Conscience money from a murderer." She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, needing to escape before she completely fell apart in front of both Mitchell brothers. "Emily, wait," Ryan called after her, but she was already in the hallway, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor. Behind her, she heard Derek's low chuckle. 48 hours, brother. And I'd suggest you accept my offer. Because if this goes public, Miss Carter won't be the only one whose life gets destroyed." Emily jabbed the elevator call button repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. When the doors finally opened, she stumbled inside and collapsed against the wall, her body shaking with the force of revelations that had just torn her world apart. Her mother's killer had tried to buy her silence before she was even old enough to understand what silence meant. The man she was falling in love with carried the blood of her mother's murderer in his veins. And now she had to decide whether justice was worth destroying the only person who'd ever made her feel alive. The elevator carried her down toward the lobby, toward a world that would never look the same again. Emily didn't return to Mitchell Industries for 3 days. She called in sick, her voice hollow enough that Ryan didn't question the excuse. and spent 72 hours in her studio apartment researching everything she could find about Derek Mitchell, Marcus Webb, and the financial records surrounding her mother's death. What she discovered made her question everything Derek had shown them. The public records were inconsistent. Derek's birth certificate listed his father as unknown, but the version he presented to Ryan showed Robert Mitchell's name clearly typed in the paternal field. Emily had spent enough time reviewing documents in her architectural work to recognize discrepancies, and these weren't clerical errors. They were deliberate alterations. On Thursday morning, she finally called James Parker. "I need to see those files again," she said when he answered. "All of them. Everything you didn't show me the first time." They met at the same coffee shop, but this time Parker brought a larger folder. His weathered face was grim as he spread photographs and documents across the small table. "I've been doing some digging since our last conversation," he said. "Derek Mitchell contacted me 6 months ago, wanted copies of everything I had on your mother's case. Said he was researching his family history." Emily's stomach clenched. "You gave him the files?" "Copies, yes. I figured if Robert Mitchell had another son, he deserved to know the truth about his father." Parker pulled out a police report Emily hadn't seen before. "But something bothered me about his story, so I did some checking." The report was a birth record request from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, dated 6 months ago. Derek Mitchell had requested a certified copy of his own birth certificate, claiming the original had been lost. "Problem is," Parker continued, "I called the hospital where he claimed to be born, St. Elizabeth's in Brighton. They have no record of a Derek Mitchell being born there on the date he provided. No record of his mother, Linda Mitchell, being admitted for delivery." Emily studied the document carefully. "So his birth certificate is fake?" "More than that. I ran his fingerprints through the system." Parker produced another sheet, this one showing a criminal background check. "Derek Mitchell doesn't exist. The man calling himself Derek Mitchell is actually David Ashford, son of Marcus Ashford." The name hit Emily like a physical blow. "Marcus Ashford?" "As in, Marcus Ashford, Robert Mitchell's former business partner. The one who got squeezed out when Robert decided to go legitimate back in the early 90s. Parker leaned forward. "Ashford lost everything when Robert dissolved their partnership. His construction company went bankrupt, his marriage fell apart, and he spent the last 20 years bouncing between jobs and holding grudges." Emily's mind raced, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "So Derek isn't Robert's son at all. He's the son of someone who wanted revenge against the Mitchell family." "Gets better. I tracked down Marcus Webb, the guy Derek claimed was a contract killer. Webb's been in federal prison for 8 years, but not for murder, tax evasion, and fraud. And he's never heard of Robert Mitchell or Sarah Carter." The implications crashed over Emily like a wave. Derek had manipulated everything, using real evidence of Robert's financial crimes while fabricating the murder plot entirely. Her mother might have died in an actual accident, just as the original police report stated. Emily's phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. "Please come back. We need to talk. I can't do this without you." She stared at the message, torn between the relief flooding through her and the anger that Derek had twisted her emotions so expertly. Her mother hadn't been murdered, but Robert Mitchell was still a criminal who destroyed families through his money laundering operation. "There's something else," Parker said, pulling Emily back to the present. "I found the real Marcus Webb. He died in a car accident in 1998, a year before your mother. Natural accident, verified by multiple witnesses." Emily's head was spinning. So Derek found a dead man's name and built an entire fabricated story around it. Exactly. He needed someone to blame for your mother's death, someone who couldn't contradict his story. Parker gathered the documents back into his folder. "The question is, what are you going to do with this information?" Emily thought about Ryan, about the way his face had crumpled when Derek revealed the supposed murder memo, about the trust fund Robert had established, the blood money she'd never claimed, about the kiss they'd shared that had tasted like hope before Derek's lies had poisoned everything. "I need to get back to the office," she said finally. When Emily arrived at Mitchell Industries that afternoon, Ryan's office was empty. His secretary, Margaret, looked up with relief when Emily approached. "Thank goodness you're back," Margaret said. "Mr. Mitchell has been impossible since Tuesday. He's been asking about you every hour." "Where is he?" "Conference room 20. He's been meeting with lawyers all day, something about transferring company assets." Margaret lowered her voice. He looks terrible, Emily. Like he hasn't slept in days. Emily found Ryan sitting alone at the long conference table, surrounded by legal documents and empty coffee cups. He looked up when she entered, and her heart clenched at the exhaustion etched in his features. "You came back," he said quietly. "We need to talk." Emily closed the door and took the seat across from him. "Derek isn't your brother." Ryan's pen stopped moving across the contract he'd been signing. "What?" Emily laid out everything Parker had discovered, watching Ryan's expression shift from confusion to understanding to rage. By the time she finished, his hands were clenched into fists on the table. "He played us," Ryan said, his voice deadly quiet. "All of it was manipulation. The paternity claim, the murder evidence, everything." "Not everything. Your father was still laundering money. That part was real." Emily met his gaze directly. "But my mother wasn't murdered. Derek fabricated that entire story to make us both suffer." Ryan stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "I've been ready to sign over half the company to stop him from exposing a murder that never happened." "Why?" Emily asked. "Even if the murder had been real, why sacrifice everything your family built?" Ryan turned back to her, and the raw honesty in his expression took her breath away. "Because I love you. Because the thought of you believing I was complicit in your mother's death was killing me. Because I would have given up everything if it meant you could forgive me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with emotion and possibility. Emily felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, but she forced herself to remain strong. "I can't do this, Ryan. Even knowing the truth about Derek, even knowing my mother wasn't murdered, there's still too much history between our families. Too much pain." "So you're leaving?" It wasn't a question, and Emily could hear the defeat in his voice. "I think it's best." Ryan nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this answer. "I've already prepared my resignation from the company. I was planning to announce it tomorrow, after I transferred the assets to Derek." "You can't do that now. Derek has no legitimate claim to anything." "Maybe not. But I can't stay here knowing that every day I look at you will be a reminder of what we could have had." Ryan's smile was heartbreakingly sad. "I love you too much to put you through that." Emily stood on unsteady legs, her heart breaking for both of them. "Ryan, go, Emily, before I do something stupid like beg you to stay." She walked to the door, her hand trembling on the handle. "For what it's worth," she said without turning around, "I love you too. But sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the past." Emily left Ryan sitting alone among his legal documents, planning to sacrifice his legacy for a love that circumstances wouldn't allow them to keep. Behind her, she could hear his phone ringing, probably Derek calling to gloat about his victory. Neither of them realized that Emily's discoveries were about to turn Derek's carefully constructed revenge plot into the weapon that would ultimately destroy him. Emily spent Friday night staring at the ceiling of her apartment. Parker's evidence spread across her coffee table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. By dawn, she'd made a decision that would either save Ryan or destroy them both. She called Parker at 7 in the morning. "I want to take Derek down," she said without preamble. "But I need your help." Parker's gravelly chuckle came through the phone. "About time. What did you have in mind?" "Derek thinks he's won. He believes Ryan is going to sign over the company and that I'm too broken to fight back. We're going to use that arrogance against him." 2 hours later, Emily sat across from Parker in his cramped apartment in Southie, surrounded by decades of case files and police memorabilia. The retired detective had listened to her plan with the intensity of a man who'd been waiting 24 years to see justice served. "It's risky," Parker said, adjusting the recording equipment they'd borrowed from his former partner still on the force. "If Derek suspects you're wearing a wire, this could go sideways fast." Emily tested the tiny microphone taped beneath her blouse collar. "He won't suspect anything. He thinks I'm a grieving daughter who's lost everything. He's counting on my emotional state to keep me compliant." "And Ryan? Does he know what you're planning?" Emily's chest tightened. "No, he can't know. Derek will be watching his every move, and Ryan's not a good enough actor to hide what he's feeling." Parker handed her a burner phone programmed with his direct number. "If anything feels wrong, if Derek seems suspicious, you get out immediately. Don't try to be a hero." Emily pocketed the phone and stood. "Derek called yesterday, wanting to meet this morning. He's probably planning to gloat about breaking up me and Ryan. Just remember, we need him to confess on tape. His real name, his father's identity, The forged documents. Without that confession, we can't prove fraud. Emily nodded and headed for the door. As her hand touched the handle, Parker called her name. Your mother would be proud, he said quietly. Sarah Carter was a fighter. She never backed down from corruption, even when it cost her everything. Emily met Derek at an upscale restaurant in Back Bay, the kind of place where business deals were made over expensive wine and handshake agreements that destroyed lives. He was already seated when she arrived, looking perfectly composed in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Emily, he said, rising to pull out her chair. You look terrible. I hope my revelations about your family history haven't been too overwhelming. Emily forced herself to appear fragile, defeated. It wasn't entirely an act. The past week had drained her emotionally, leaving dark circles under her eyes and a hollow quality to her voice that Derek would interpret as grief. I've been thinking about what you said, she began, accepting the glass of wine he poured for her. About Ryan and his family's crimes. Derek's smile was predatory. And what conclusions have you reached? That you're right. The Mitchells destroyed my family and used blood money to ease their guilt. Ryan might not have pulled the trigger, but he's benefited from my mother's death his entire life. A pragmatic assessment. Derek leaned back in his chair, studying her face. What do you intend to do about it? Emily took a shaky breath, playing the part of a woman on the edge of breakdown. I want to make them pay. All of them. But I don't know how. Revenge is a dish best served strategically, Derek said, his eyes gleaming. Ryan is planning to sign over half the company to me by Monday. But half measures aren't enough, are they? Not when your mother's blood is on their hands. Emily nodded, leaning forward conspiratorially. What did you have in mind? Derek pulled out his tablet, the same one he'd used to show the forged documents. I've been documenting every crime the Mitchell family has committed over the past 30 years. Money laundering, tax evasion, bribery, murder. With your help, we could expose everything. My help? You have access to Ryan's private files, his personal communications. You could gather evidence that even he doesn't know exists. Derek's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Imagine the headlines. CEO's assistant exposes family crime syndicate. You'd be a hero, Emily. A woman who brought down the empire built on her mother's grave. Emily felt sick listening to Derek's manipulation, but she forced herself to nod eagerly. That sounds perfect. But how do we make sure Ryan can't destroy the evidence before we go public? Derek's smile widened. Because I have insurance. Documents that prove my father, Marcus Ashford, was Robert Mitchell's original partner. When Robert squeezed him out of the business, my father lost everything. His company, his reputation, his family. Emily's pulse quickened. Derek was finally revealing the truth, and the recording device was capturing every word. Marcus Ashford died bitter and broken, but not before he told me everything about the Mitchell family's crimes, including details about your mother's investigation that never made it into the police reports. What kind of details? Derek leaned closer, his voice thick with vindictive pleasure. Sarah Carter had discovered that Robert was using murdered homeless people's identities to create shell companies. She wasn't just tracking money laundering. She'd uncovered a network of identity theft connected to at least 12 unsolved disappearances. Emily's blood ran cold. Even knowing Derek was lying, the casual way he invented such horrific crimes made her stomach turn. Of course, that's not entirely accurate, Derek continued, apparently enjoying Emily's horror. I've embellished certain details to make the story more compelling for the media. The truth is messier, less dramatic. Your mother really did die in an accident, but where's the justice in that? Emily's breath caught. You made up the murder? I created a better narrative. One that serves our purposes. Derek pulled up another screen on his tablet, showing what appeared to be bank records. These transfer records to Marcus Webb? Completely fabricated. Webb died years before your mother, but dead men make excellent scapegoats. Emily forced herself to remain calm despite the rage building in her chest. But the memo from Robert Mitchell. Oh, that's real. Robert did write about eliminating threats to the business. He was referring to a hostile takeover attempt by a competitor, but with the right context, it reads like a murder order. Derek's laugh was cold. Amazing how documentation can be reinterpreted to serve different narratives. Emily's hands were shaking now, but not from grief. From fury. So you've been lying about everything. I've been creating justice where none existed, Derek corrected. The Mitchell family destroyed mine. Now I'm destroying theirs. The methods are irrelevant compared to the outcome. Emily stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the restaurant's hardwood floor. I need to think about this. Derek caught her wrist as she turned to leave. Don't take too long deciding, Emily. Ryan is planning to leave Boston after he signs over the company. If you want your revenge, this is your only chance. Emily pulled free of his grip. I'll call you tomorrow. She walked out of the restaurant on unsteady legs, her heart pounding with the knowledge that she'd gotten everything they needed on tape. Derek had confessed to fraud, identity theft, falsifying evidence, and conspiracy. His own arrogance had provided the rope for his hanging. Emily made it 2 blocks before pulling out the burner phone. Parker? I got it. All of it. Outstanding. How soon can you get to the station? Emily looked back toward the restaurant, where Derek was probably still sitting at their table, believing he'd just recruited an ally in his war against the Mitchell family. I'm on my way. As she hailed a taxi, Emily felt something she hadn't experienced since her mother's death, the satisfaction of knowing that justice was finally within reach. Derek had spent months playing puppet master, manipulating emotions and manufacturing evidence to destroy innocent people. Now it was Emily's turn to pull the strings. By evening, Derek would be in custody, his elaborate revenge plot exposed as the fraud it had always been. And for the first time since she'd walked into Mitchell Industries 3 weeks ago, Emily would be free to choose her own future. The question was whether that future included forgiving Ryan Mitchell for the sins of his father, or walking away from the only man who'd ever made her believe in love again. Derek Mitchell was arrested at his hotel room that evening while packing for what the FBI later discovered would have been a flight to the Cayman Islands. Emily watched from Parker's car as federal agents led him away in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled and his carefully constructed facade finally cracking. Marcus David Ashford, Parker said, reading from the arrest warrant. Fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, extortion. He's looking at 15 to 20 years. Emily felt no satisfaction watching Derek's downfall, only a hollow exhaustion that came from months of emotional manipulation finally ending. What happens now? Now you go home and figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life. Parker studied her profile, starting with whether you're going to let pride cost you the best thing that ever happened to you. Emily didn't answer, but Parker's words echoed in her head during the drive back to her apartment. Ryan had called 17 times since that afternoon, each voicemail more desperate than the last. She'd listened to them all, but hadn't found the courage to call back. Monday morning found Emily at Mitchell Industries for what she assumed would be her final day. She drafted her resignation letter over the weekend, a professional document that cited personal reasons and gave 2 weeks' notice. But when the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, she found Ryan's office empty and Margaret packing files into cardboard boxes. Where is he? Emily asked. Margaret looked up with red-rimmed eyes. He submitted his resignation to the board this morning, effective immediately. Said he couldn't stay knowing it caused you pain. Emily's chest constricted. Where did he go? I don't know. He cleared out his personal items before dawn and left this for you. Margaret handed Emily a sealed envelope with her name written in Ryan's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a set of keys. Emily, the letter began, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know Derek's arrest changes everything, but it doesn't erase the pain my family caused yours. I can't ask you to forgive what can't be undone. The keys are to the warehouse on Harbor Street that my father used for storage. Inside, you'll find every document related to his illegal activities, including the original files your mother compiled. I've also established a foundation in her name, funded by the money from the accounts she discovered. Sarah Carter deserves to be remembered as the hero she was. I love you enough to let you go, but if you ever change your mind about us, I'll be at the place where this all started. Always yours, Ryan. Emily stared at the letter until the words blurred. Ryan had walked away from everything he'd built rather than put her through more pain. He'd turned his family's shame into something that honored her mother's memory, and he'd given her the choice of whether their story ended here or continued somewhere new. The warehouse on Harbor Street was exactly what Ryan had described. Boxes of evidence documenting 30 years of financial crimes, organized with the precision of someone seeking redemption rather than revenge. But it was the corner office that took Emily's breath away. The space had been converted into a memorial for Sarah Carter. Photographs of her mother at various stages of her life covered one wall. Her forensic accounting awards hung in frames beside news articles about her professional achievements. On the desk sat her mother's briefcase, the one Emily remembered from childhood, now preserved as a symbol of a woman who'd fought for justice until the end. Beneath the briefcase was a business plan for the Sarah Carter Institute for Financial Transparency, complete with budgets, staffing projections, and a mission statement that brought tears to Emily's eyes. Ryan had turned his guilt into purpose, his family's crimes into a legacy of accountability. Emily spent 2 hours in that space, finally understanding that love wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing to build something better from its ashes. When she finally left the warehouse, she knew exactly where she needed to go. She found Ryan at the Mitchell Industries boardroom, standing alone by the windows that overlooked Boston Harbor. He turned when he heard her footsteps, his face a mixture of hope and resignation. "I thought you'd left already," Emily said, setting the warehouse keys on the conference table. "I was supposed to. Had a flight to Chicago booked for tonight." Ryan's smile was self-deprecating. "Turns out I'm not very good at walking away from the things I love." Emily moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way 3 weeks of emotional torture had carved new lines around his mouth. "The foundation is beautiful. My mother would have been honored. It's not enough. Nothing I do will ever be enough to make up for what my family took from you." Emily reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling him tremble at her touch. "You're right. Nothing can bring my mother back or erase what your father did. But that doesn't mean we can't choose to write a different ending." Ryan's eyes searched her face desperately. "Emily, I love you," she said simply. "I love you enough to forgive what can't be changed and fight for what can be. The question is whether you love me enough to stop punishing yourself for crimes you didn't commit." Ryan's answer was to kiss her with 24 years of grief and hope and desperate love, his hands tangling in her hair, as if he could anchor them both to this moment of choosing each other over the ghosts that had haunted them both. When they finally broke apart, Emily rested her forehead against his. "We have work to do. The Sarah Carter Institute isn't going to run itself. And someone needs to make sure you don't sacrifice any more companies for love." Ryan's laugh was shaky with relief. "Is that a job offer, Miss Carter?" "It's a partnership proposal, Mr. Mitchell. Personal and professional. What do you say?" Ryan's answer was another kiss that tasted like forgiveness and second chances and a future neither of them had dared to imagine possible. 6 months later, Emily Carter and Ryan Mitchell were married in the gardens behind the Sarah Carter Institute, surrounded by the friends and colleagues who'd watched them fight their way back to each other. The Institute's marble facade gleamed in the afternoon sun, its mission statement etched in gold, dedicated to transparency, accountability, and the belief that truth serves justice. As they exchanged vows beneath the oak trees Sarah Carter had once admired during her lunch breaks, Emily felt her mother's presence like a blessing. Love hadn't erased the pain of the past, but it had transformed that pain into purpose. They'd built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy, proving that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that refuse to let darkness have the final word.